It was a Saturday morning when Ayo heard the doorbell ring. She went to open the door to find a nurse standing at the doorway. She was perplexed by the noise in her home. Boronti explained that Mrs. Oyebola had requested her services. Ayo was not a woman who was easily threatened, so seeing the beautiful nurse before her only made her appreciate how beautiful she was. But she didn't understand why her mother-in-law didn't discuss with her and her husband about wanting a private nurse to care for her. Ronti did a 360 in the house once Mrs. Ayo went to get her husband, and she loved what she saw. But more than that, she loved the sight of the man once she finished her sight of the house. Femi was also surprised to see the nurse, since his mother didn't mention anything about it to him. But he was secretly glad that she would have a professional to help her, because he saw how much of a toll it took on Hayo and even himself whenever he helped her. It wasn't easy to care for a disabled person. Ronti thought the man before her was a fine piece, and he was rich. That was the cherry on top of the cake. The house wasn't bad to live in. He had a wife, but what man doesn't come with a baggage? They all eventually fell for her, and Mr. Femi would be no exception, she thought. Mrs. Oyebola's doctor had told her that Ronti was one of the best nurses out there, and she was glad she was able to book her. She was going to be with her 24/7, which was a service she wasn't getting from her so-called daughter-in-law. She didn't understand why she had to work. Her son was rich, and that wealth wouldn't disappear anytime soon. But she was glad Ronti was there. She was beautiful and kind, and she did her job to the T. Mrs. Oyebola had a goal in mind, and that was to end her son's first marriage. The first step was to make sure Ayo doesn't get pregnant. And so, she called Ronti to her room one evening. She knew that no matter how kind someone was, money was the root of all evil. She told Ronti a sob story about how her daughter-in-law didn't treat her well, which was why she asked for a private nurse, and she always pretended in front of her son to be caring. She promised to pay Ronti an extra 100,000 naira with the 50,000 naira she collected every month. Ronti's eyes went wide, but she quickly concealed her surprise. Ronti was no one's fool. She knew the kind of person Mrs. Ayo was. She was a kind woman who always asked her about the well-being of her mother-in-law. She also wanted to be updated on the drugs she gave her and how her mother-in-law's visit to the doctor was. But Ronti had her own plans, so if the old lady wanted to kick out her daughter-in-law, she would be more than happy to help her cause. She looked at Mrs. Oyebola and said, "I will help you, so your son can be happy. You are like a mother to me. I want you to be healthy and happy." Mrs. Oyebola was not surprised that Ronti agreed to help her. A little tear, a little stop story from an old woman always pulled at people's heartstrings. Plus, money helped reeling the fish. The reason why she sought Ronti's help was because of the first part of her plan. Since Ronti was a nurse, it would be easier for her to get a massive amount of birth control pills, and also, since she couldn't yet walk without the help of her wheelchair, she needed someone to be her eyes, ears, and legs. Ronti worked for her money and her interest. She would wake up earlier than everyone in the house and make fruit juice for the whole house. And with this, she would put the crushed birth control pills in Ayo's juice. This went on for weeks, and they didn't seem to stop there. Ronti was doing her part, and then some. She would talk to Femi every and any chance she got. It was easy for her to form a sort of bond because the man wanted to know about his mother's health, and she used that as a stepping stone. Although she couldn't get farther than that, but it still gave her a chance for him to speak and look at her. Ayo didn't feel any different for weeks, while her mother-in-law had been drugging her with birth control pills. Only that she felt drowsy at times, and her breasts sometimes hurt. But she thought that perhaps it was her own birth control pills that was acting up. She and Femi had decided to have kids 2 years after their wedding. They had tried IUD, but it hadn't sit well with her body, so they used birth control pills and protection. Of course, Mrs. Oyebola wasn't aware of this. One day, Ayomide fainted when she was at work. She was rushed to the hospital and her husband was called. The doctor warned her to take it easy with taking too much birth control pills. She was confused. She only took it once every day and no more than that. Perhaps you forgot you had taken it, then took it again, the doctor said. Ayomide was perplexed. She didn't think too deeply about it. Perhaps she had taken too much by mistake. And so, she forgot all about it. When Mrs. Oyebola heard about what happened to Ayo, she reduced the dosage of the pills. On the day Ronti was off duty, Mrs. Oyebola had tried to use a crutch but couldn't, so she fell off the bed. Ayo, hearing her mother-in-law fall, rushed to help her. It occurred to her that this accident could happen again, and so she consulted with her husband and they decided to install a security camera, but small enough so no one could detect it. Femi didn't tell his mother about it because she would refuse and they wanted to make sure she was alright when they couldn't be there physically. At least they could watch her on any device and make sure she was okay. Mrs. Oyebola hadn't made any headway in her plans to break her son's marriage. But then she realized that there was a certain anxious woman who lived in this house, except her daughter-in-law, and that was Ronti. Perhaps it was time to introduce the other woman into her son's life. After all men loved beautiful women. Mrs. Oyebola had Ronti add 3 pills to her daughter-in-law's juice. She did this because she wanted to carry out her next plan. After taking the juice the next morning, Ayomide felt weak the entire day, so she decided to stay home and rest. When Femi came back home, Ayo was fast asleep, and Ronti came to welcome him. He was uncomfortable, not because she was in his home, she was supposed to be there. It was the way she dressed and the way she smelled. She was dressed in a short, tight dress, and she was wearing too much makeup. But it was the perfume that she was wearing that made him uncomfortable. It smelled so much like his wife's. At first, he couldn't find his words, but the moment she moved closer to him, he uttered his first sentence since he came home. "Good night," he said, leaving a shocked Ronti standing in the living room with no idea what to do with herself. Ronti was livid the moment she got to the safety of her room. She began to throw things. She couldn't believe this man had rejected her. She was light-skinned, beautiful, and she wasn't wearing a lot of clothes. So she didn't understand why he had preferred to go to his sick wife instead of him to come to her. The old woman's plan had not worked. But just like Satan, she would tempt him again and again until he gave in. And so, she tried, day after day and after day. But there was only so much a man could endure. Finally, Femi was annoyed at this woman's audacity. He yelled at her because of her repeated attempts and fired her on the spot. Ronti ran to Mrs. Oyebola and told her what had happened. Mrs. Oyebola was sure her son would look at Ronti's way. Ronti turned sour and angry at the audacity of Femi to reject her time and time again. She turned to Mrs. Oyebola and demanded she compensate her for her humiliation and her loss of job, but she was going to tell her son everything they had done. Mrs. Oyebola was angry, but she knew Ronti was money hungry and she needed to keep her secret for as long as she could. So, she gave Ronti 50,000 naira. But Ronti was appalled at this amount. She knew she could afford to give her more than that. And so, she asked for more. Mrs. Oyebola gave her an extra 100,000, but this wasn't enough. Mrs. Oyebola had had enough of this street rat and told her that even if she had told her son what they were doing, yes, her son would be angry with her, but she would lose her license to be a nurse. So she should take what was given to her, or she can say goodbye to her career. Ronti reluctantly accepted the 150,000 naira given to her. She had decided she wouldn't leave just like that. So the next morning, before anyone could wake up, she packed her things and went into Mrs. Oyebola's room and took some of her jewelry while she was sleeping and left the house, never to be seen again. Femi told Ayo what had happened. Ayo couldn't believe it. She liked Ronti. She didn't know the woman had crossed her boundaries not once, but apparently 3 times. But she was also upset with Femi because he didn't tell her when it had happened the first time. He apologized for his bad decision in keeping it from her when it happened the first time. And Ayo forgave Femi after he pled with her. Mrs. Oyebola's leg was getting better. It had been 3 months since she had been using a crutch to walk, and she was getting better at using it. But right now, she was more preoccupied with looking for a jewelry set her late husband had given her for her 30th birthday. It was a favorite. She told Ayo, and they both searched for it, but didn't find it. But then Mrs. Oyebola thought, what if Ronti had stolen them? She didn't tell Ayo her thoughts because then everything they had done would be out in the open. Ayo couldn't stop thinking about the stolen jewelry and how much it meant to her mother-in-law. Then she remembered the CCTV cameras that were installed. They were so small that she forgot they were even there. So she searched and watched hours and hours of footage. Then she saw a footage of Ronti adding something to her juice, and she seemed to do it every day. She was confused. It was in powder form and in a container. Then she watched more footage and found Ronti stealing her mother-in-law's jewelry. But before that, she found one of her mother-in-law and Ronti planning to put birth control pills into her juice and also planning to seduce her husband to get Ronti into his bed. Ayo cried and cried and cried when she watched as her mother-in-law and Ronti plot against her. This was the woman she welcomed into her home and treated like her very own mother. And yet, she had stuck a knife in her back and twisted it all the way, because the way she imagined and planned her son's life hadn't panned out like she thought. Mrs. Oyebola should have known that the moment you underestimate an enemy is the moment you lose the war. She cleaned off her tears and went about her day like nothing happened. Later that day, she brought her mother-in-law a cup of warm milk, and the unsuspecting Mrs. Oyebola drank to the very last drop. Once Mrs. Oyebola had slept off, she dragged her and put her in the back seat of the car, with a wheelchair in the trunk. She got in the driver's seat and drove off. Mrs. Oyebola woke up to a start at the sound of the heavy rain. The moment she opened her eyes, she was shocked, soaked, and rattled. She was sitting in a wheelchair on the road with heavy traffic. She was confused because the last thing she remembered was falling asleep in her room. The thunder shook her even more, and she searched her body, only to find her phone. But there was a message. She clicked on the message, unable to see properly because of the heavy downpour. The message said, I know what you did. You are no longer welcome in my home. You were right. Trash should be left outside. Mrs. Oyebola screamed at no one in particular in the heavy rainfall, but the sky seemed even angrier as it roared and thundered. She tried to roll herself off the road to get to safety. Ayo had texted Femi from his mother's phone while she was asleep. She had told him that she had decided to go back home, since she was better now, and she wanted to enjoy her time with her friends. So when Femi came home, he didn't ask about his mother, he just enjoyed a night in with his wife. They didn't hear from Mrs. Oyebola as much, except for the odd phone calls and the short conversations of, how are you? I'm fine. Are you sure? Okay. Bye. 2.5 years later, they welcomed a beautiful baby girl. Femi's mother offered her congratulations from afar, for the fear of her son knowing what she did. The end. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. What did you think of Ayo's revenge? Let me know what you guys think about how Ayo handled this situation, and if you think Mrs. Oyebola deserved something even worse. Let me know your thoughts down below. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video.